not a good look for our profession.
How in the name of common sense did this ever get this far? Vaccines are not seek and destroy missions.
Because he was so severe.
This is nuts.
One of the top 20 things that she has discovered with her research company, Progenobiome, medicine has been corrupted. Where we go from here now, I don't know. Well, it doesn't work.
So angry, punishable with jail time.
Literally, this makes me believe we live in the Matrix.
Like, deadliest year in U.S. history.
It wasn't a question of if, but when.
First red.
If it doesn't work and it's safe, put it in a little Fauci Pez dispenser, give it to the patient, and shut the family up.
It's going to get worse and worse and worse.
Gave Fauci an award for being a hero of the pandemic.
This has been a problem.
These were lies.
Let's talk about the healthcare professionals supporting this.
In the meantime, what was going on behind the scenes?
Irony of the whole thing is,
Harvey's 100% correct.
This is freaking annoying.
Ultimately, we need to have hope for America.
What is going on here? What has poisoned your mind? Buckle up, kids.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to BS Free MD. And we are so excited to have with us on our show for the fifth time, I think, this episode, Dr. Peter McCullough. I think most of our listeners are pretty familiar with who he is, but if you're
not, stop wasting your life.
Well, and actually I was at the doctor's office today and my physician gynecologist was unaware of who he was. So I'm going to give a brief bio and we'll get into his new book title that he's here to share with us and talk. But Dr. Peter McCullough is a world-renowned cardiologist, and he actually is internist cardiologist, epidemiologist, holding degrees from Baylor University, University of Texas Southwest Medical School, University of Michigan, and Southern Methodist University. He has broadly published on a range of topics in medicine with over 1,000 publications and over 700 citations. And he's a well-known public figure in medicine, as well as a frequent contributor on numerous mainstream and independent media platforms, including his own podcast and a member of the Wellness Company. He has testified multiple times in front of the U.S. Senate, U.S. House of Representatives, European Parliament, and many state capitals concerning public health policy. He has been on our show before to talk about his previous book co-authored with John Leake, and now he has a new publication out.
Yeah, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. This is an awesome interview. It's very balanced because it's Peter. He's very data-driven or data-driven, depending on where you live. And you're going to really, really love it. It was great to catch up with him a little bit. And he's doing really well. And it's great to see it's more and more independent doctors just practicing medicine and using their heads. So without any further ado, here we go with the great Peter McCullough.
All right.
Welcome back to the show, Dr. Peter McCullough. So happy to have you back on our show again. It's been a while, and we're excited to have you here now to talk today. I think the tune that we're changing to is now kind of focusing more on your new book and questioning childhood vaccines, not just the big jab. And so, why don't you kick it off and tell us about your book and what was the inspiration behind getting that out?
Well, thanks so much for having me back on the show. It's great to be BS free for once in medicine. I'm broadcasting from the new McCullough Foundation studio. You probably noticed I've kind of upped my game here. So this is my studio room. Next door is a lobby. And then on the other side is actually my exam room. So I'm in clinical practice as an internist and cardiologist, Dr. Peter McCullough. And we operate the foundation here at my practice, which like yours now, I think is completely independent. I don't have any dependency on hospital systems or medical groups. And with my co-author, John Leake, we've done a careful examination of the history of vaccines. And the title of our book is Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. It's trending #1 in Amazon in vaccines, medical history, and immunology right now. So it's really on fire. And let me tell you what we found is carefully cited. What we found is this entire field has been a cauldron of fear and of hubris, power, and money. Yes, money going back to the early 18th century, right on up to Pfizer and Moderna. It's the same.
Well,
Wow.
yeah, and as
we think of just what's been happening with the childhood vaccines and now, but that's fascinating about the history going that far back about the money grab, and I'd be interested in hearing about more about that.
the part that I felt so guilty about having finally gone down the rabbit hole, like when you look at a book like Dissolving Illusions, and everyone brings up smallpox. Well, we eliminated smallpox with the vaccine. That's kind of the discussion. Well, that was 1798, and they were literally scraping boils on the backside of a cow and then scraping people with that. That was the onset of vaccination, and then they would have all these people die of erysipelas. A terrible skin infection, because that was literally vaccination. We think vaccination started in 1798 and it came in these beautiful sterilized Louis Pasteur bottles. It didn't. It was a nightmare.
In fact, we go before that to a process called variolation.
Yes.
That was very early in the 17th century. And it turns out the Egyptians and Africans had played with this. There was some work in Constantinople, but we pick it up in Boston, Massachusetts with Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather is a Puritan minister who, with Dr. Boylston, becomes so enthralled with variolation, that is, taking one kid with smallpox, taking a little bit of pus out of his pustule and injecting it into another kid, that Cotton Mather proclaims that this is a gift from God. Okay, that's around 1721 or so. And turns out Cotton Mather had another important role in history. He was an advisor to the judges in the Salem witchcraft trials. So the same guy who proclaimed variolation was from God also believed in witches.
Wow.
Well, and burning lots of witches. Yeah, he was like central. I read Bill O'Reilly's book about the whole witchcraft thing, and it was amazing because Cotton Mather was he's like the Anthony Fauci of witch burning.
But remember, Anthony Fauci precedes Edward Jenner and the cowpox by 70 years. And in fact, Ben Franklin was writing kind of some sarcastic commentary on what Cotton Mather and Dr. Boylston were doing until Ben Franklin's little son Frankie dies. It's unclear if what he died of, potentially smallpox. And then Franklin actually changes his tune and said, maybe we should be doing this as Cotton Mather was doing this. But it turned out that smallpox is spread by skin to skin, just like with monkeypox and the other pox illnesses. So the kids were sleeping together. That's how it spread. So nobody knew back at the time of variolation or even cowpox vaccination, no one knew it was a virus and no one knew how it spread. So just getting the kids to sleep in separate beds, washing the bed sheets. A lot of times they were sleeping on straw, which kind of kept all the pus there. Just that alone, smallpox dropped precipitously. And, there's still some smallpox around. There's sporadic cases, but it doesn't take off like it used to. They stopped vaccinating in 1976. So I got a smallpox vaccine myself. You guys probably did too. But the bottom line is it was improved sanitation, living conditions, washing bed sheets that made smallpox go away. The smallpox vaccine on top of that was probably icing on the cake. And I do believe the final smallpox vaccine that we have, that the one that was in final use, looked reasonably safe. But boy, as you pointed out, the early versions were grossly unsafe. Another example is actually King George III. This is another good one. King George III has 15 kids. We believe he actually, vaccinated all the kids for smallpox. Turns out two kids die. Two kids die, royal family, they die, and they still promote vaccination for the whole country. Now, you may ask, what was in their minds? They may have thought, listen, we had 15, we lost 2. That's not bad. Maybe the vaccine protected everybody. So a lot of people assumed once the shot was given that they had this magical protection.
So speaking of magical protection, the thing that always comes up is polio. And, we wiped out polio because of the polio vaccine. And, I've gone down that rabbit hole a little bit as far as, the contamination with SV40 and all of the stuff. And then the initial vaccine, the Cutter incident, where they actually had this vaccine that wasn't properly made and it killed several children. And they had to, that's how we switched over to the Salk vaccine, or the Sabin vaccine rather, from the Salk vaccine. So tell us a bit about polio, because polio is a very misunderstood illness by most people when you talk about it. They, and this is the one, even our daughter, we're like, I think I'd be really nervous about, vaccinating our potential grandkids. And she's like, well, I don't want them to get polio. So if you could address a little bit of that I think would be super helpful.
Well, the first point is polio is in the water. It's a waterborne illness. So we have a polio surveillance program in the United States, the whole Western Hemisphere. Polio has not been in the water supply of the Western Hemisphere for decades. So it would be impossible to get polio now because it's simply not there. But the chapter of our book, chapter 14, Polio, the Big Scare and Savior, points out that the first case was described, we believe, in 1789 in a treatise on children by English physician Michael Underwood. And no one knew a child who was afflicted with paralysis, whether it be temporary or permanent, no one knew if that was polio or not. Could have been Guillain-Barré syndrome, could have been a plexopathy, a brachial plexopathy. No one knew. There was a famous University of Michigan study done, about 1,200 kids with, quote, polio, when they finally had the ability to diagnose polio with lab testing. And the answer was only 25% really had polio. So there was 75% were mimics, but there was never a polio epidemic. This is really important. I'm reading from the book here. So the last year before the polio vaccine was introduced, we had 38,476 cases. Okay. And the death rate was 1 per 100,000. So it was way less than one person died per year of polio. And
but that's not what people think of. They think of debilitating illness, so not death, but the morbidity associated with polio, the paralysis, the lifelong paralysis, really.
Right. I mean, that's a fair point. And people think of the iron lung machine, which was like the early mechanical ventilator.
Right.
So I'll never forget when there was some discussion. Anderson Cooper this year with Sanjay Gupta said, well, if RFK gets in place, polio is going to come back. And they showed pictures of the iron lung. Like suddenly we'd give up modern mechanical ventilation and start using an iron lung. But it just goes to show you how bad Sanjay Gupta is.
Yes.
He should immediately, as a responsible doctor, say, listen, the iron lung is a historical instrument.
It's out.
We use mechanical ventilation if someone actually really needed it.
But I get the fear because I think,
and I do have some patients in my practice who have had paralytic polio. But let me give you an idea. This is important. In the peak of this, 1952, the summer, that nation, the nation was gripped in fear. The reported incidence of the disease had been rising, but in 1952, 58,000 cases reported, with 3,145 people dying and 21,269 left with mild to disabling paralysis. That was as bad as it ever got. And that was before the water supply was cleared up. So then what happened is the first set of polio vaccines were the oral polio vaccines. Those were the Sabin vaccines. That's what I got when I was a kid. I got the oral polio vaccines. And it turns out that they did protect against the invasive paralytic disease. That was important, but it contributed more polio to the water supply because you eat the virus and it comes out. And so the great concern is, the oral would be good if you can get oral to everybody, but if you can't, then you're actually contributing more polio. So they ultimately phased out the oral and gave the injectable. And so my mom and dad and my doctors back then were paralyzed, with fear. So they took myself and my brothers in for shots. So I got a full round of the orals and I got a full round of the shots. And we put that
Wow.
in my book. We said, the McCullough boys, we're not going to be paralyzed with polio. But you're right. The current polio vaccine today, the IPV, it's one of the few single vaccines today. I've looked at the safety profile, probably one of the safest vaccines out there. So, it's kind of ironic. The safest vaccine out there is for a disease that essentially doesn't exist.
That's what I was just about to say, because getting to the point of what's worth giving and what's worth not, especially with the massive amount of childhood vaccines that there are now. I mean, we'll get to hepatitis B, but I'm thinking if we were monitoring the water supply, polio is such a low risk unless you're taking your kid to a third world country traveling. I mean, is it enough of a risk to have, say, people and immigrants who are unvaccinated bringing it into the country that it's still worthwhile vaccinating children against? Does that make
Well,
sense?
again, our water surveillance, gosh, I think one person had it in New York City and they nailed it down right away. I mean, we've got such good surveillance. I'd say, listen, if you were born into a family of Christian missionaries and you're going to go to Pakistan or Tibet, where polio is still, in the water, I'd say, yeah. But I just don't think it's compelling. And remember, when things are sufficiently rare, any side effect is unacceptable. Any
Right.
side effect.
No, and that's exactly the point. This is what drives me nuts, and this is what really I love that you have mythology in the title of your book, because I wrote a Substack and I called it Cult Nation, and I used to think diets were the cultiest thing in medicine, because people identify not with the diet. The diet is part of them. Like, I am vegan, I am carnivore, not I eat a carnivore diet. And then I started going down the vaccine rabbit hole, and I go, no, this is 10 times more culty, because you can't question it at all. You can never ask the question. So if I went to a board meeting at the local hospital here and did a presentation on the appropriate use of antibiotics and antibiotic surveillance and antibiotic stewardship, I would be awarded a medal. If I did the exact same thing and changed the word antibiotic to vaccines, I would be burned at the stake.
Yeah.
And that's, like, to me, that finishes it. Antibiotics kill your microbiome, but so do vaccines. Our mutual friend Sabine Hazen has shown that definitively. And so it's like, it's complicated, man. And we got to be able to ask the question. And that's what drives me crazy. You can't even ask the questions.
But, people have held out kind of vaccine preventable conditions and treatable conditions. And to this day, people have said, well, polio is not treatable. We really don't know. I mean, if polio, neuronitis, if it's like transverse myelitis, maybe modern methods of plasma exchange and steroids and all the usual things, maybe it is treatable. We just don't know because there are so few cases of polio to ever know. The other illnesses now, largely have treatments. We can go through them. So diphtheria and pertussis, which I've never tested for in my career, we treat it with azithromycin. Tetanus, we clean out wounds and we use antibiotics. So we don't have cases of tetanus in the United States to any extent. So those three essentially aren't needed.
I
Haemophilus
disagree.
influenza B, readily treated with antibiotics. So is pneumococcal illness. Influenza, we've got like 4 antivirals. Respiratory syncytial virus, we even have monoclonal antibodies against that and treatment. Measles, we've got measles immunoglobulin for contacts. We've got vitamin A protocols, antibiotics, steroids. All the literature suggests the pneumonitis and the encephalitis respond very well to steroids. So we got measles covered. Mumps, we don't have any treatment for. We don't know the impact of steroids. Mumps kind of has a similar picture to EBV. Acute steroids may play a role. And then we get through the other illnesses. Hepatitis B, we don't have a treatment for, but a healthy child born today, the problem with hepatitis B vaccine is given at the wrong time. And the studies show if you vaccinate a kid according to the schedule now, they don't have any protection when they're teenagers, and they could have a sexual misadventure or use IV drugs or something like that. So the hepatitis B vaccine is okay. I took it myself, but it's just given at the wrong time. So you can see this whole vaccine schedule largely is either not medically necessary, not clinically indicated, or given at the wrong time.
No, I totally agree. I mean, we've done and seen a lot of pertussis cases, but and I've actually had 2 or 3 tetanus cases in my career,
Wow.
but now treatable with antibiotics, and
Yeah,
usually you recognize it, and it's so
the problem with tetanus is it's so unusual.
yeah,
It's diagnosing it. It's not treating it.
true.
So sometimes, like we had one case, and this woman was in the hospital for over 6 months. This was in Edmonton, Alberta.
We were interns, and it was the case that taught all of us, because she was in the ICU for so long, until one of our colleagues was one of those interns that said, questioned the attendings. He said, when her body does that, do you call that tetany, when her body
And they went,
contracts like that?
and then they made the
And
diagnosis.
like, oh, tetany. Yeah.
But
But
you could have, botulism. That's another Clostridial
Right,
species. I train at University of Washington in Seattle, and you can see these kind of rare extreme cases, but it's not the impetus to vaccinate the entire country. So even on tetanus, you could say, kind of suburban living, generally healthy people, no need.
no.
Now, if you're going to work in a fish cannery up in Ketchikan or something, or if you're out in West Texas, dealing with baling hay or something,
Mhm.
and or a good example is in disasters. So in the tsunami that affected Banda Aceh, if you remember this, there were actually real cases of tetanus afterwards, largely because people couldn't clean the wounds. So it really depends on, if you have a wound, can you clean it? Oh, by the way, the same thing applies to rabies. We spent some time on rabies. Rabies is one of the few vaccines where it's post-exposure prophylaxis, where you get a bite and then you go through this protocol. But even there, even kids bit by rabid dogs back in the time of Pasteur, they didn't all get rabies. It really depends on how deep the wound is, how good you clean it, and if the virus really takes hold. Now, recently, my daughter-in-law, who's a resident, had a kid bitten by a raccoon, a pretty good story for rabies. And she was telling me in the ER that her assignment was to take the rabies immunoglobulin and inject it right into the areas where the raccoon bit the kid. And then she did that, and then the kid went on the vaccine program. Listen, I'm fine with that, because human rabies has nearly 100% mortality. I'm perfectly fine with rabies. But, rabies immunoglobulin vaccine is given, a pretty small number of people per year. It's not what people are concerned about is this one size fits all. Give the entire population, a giant battery of vaccines.
So does your book now get into the risks and possible harms of what vaccines could be doing to kids and population over time? Let's talk about that.
Right, we do. Well, you're hitting on the big one, and we had to tackle this because it's clearly now in everyone's mind, and it is kind of a sickening thought. Now, I took all the vaccines myself. I took extra vaccines to travel. I had all my kids take the vaccine. So, I don't want people to think, wow, I'm against vaccines.
Right.
And, have you ever met Sherry Tenpenny? Have you ever met her?
No, I know of her,
No.
but we have not met her.
No.
Yeah. So I had a chance to meet her, and she's what you'd call an anti-vaxxer, right? She kind of goes against the vaccines, and she goes, oh, you were hoodwinked, and you don't know so much as me. And she was going on and on. And I said, listen, tell me your story. She goes, well, I grew up, and my father was a chiropractor, and he never had any of us take a vaccine. And I said, well, you have a great advantage from your dad.
Right.
If your mom would have taken you in at 2 and you would have been blessed with all the vaccines, you wouldn't have the same insight. Do you see what I mean? So it's not like people It's not like Sherry discovered this when she was, 9 months old and was so smart that she declined all the vaccines.
No,
It doesn't
it
work
was
that
just
way. So
right.
yeah, so listen to this. This is Jonathan Poling. He's a neurologist at Johns Hopkins,
Yep.
and he's part of this early Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, what's called the omnibus group of people who have vaccine injured children. This is astounding. So he has a normal 19-month-old baby, neurologist, and he publishes it as a case report. He says within 48 hours after immunizations due to diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, Haemophilus influenza B, measles, mumps and rubella, polio, and varicella, all together, baby gets a high fever. Within a few days, the eyes are in this ophthalmos pattern, develops a rash, and then over the next 3 months, completely regresses and develops classic autism. Okay, he describes this. He publishes in a case report. She had a genetic polymorphism, I think, in a mitochondrial enzyme. So what happens? I mean, this is stunning. What happens is they offer him a special deal. So he gets a settlement from the government, not disclosed. They pull his case out as a test case. They take the other 5,000 cases and they say, not related to the vaccines. And they discharge all the other cases. So Poling is down in Athens, Georgia, practicing neurology. He's no longer a professor at Hopkins. But this is a very important case because essentially they said for sure that battery vaccines cause autism in that child. They compensated him for it.
Mm-hmm.
And then they got him out of the omnibus as a test case because the government didn't want to pay the other families who had very similar scenarios. So where we are now is it looks like, and I gave the keynote speech at the Autism Society this year, it turns out that it's probably no single vaccine or any single ingredient. It's the sum total of giving combinations at once in a child who's susceptible, where that administration is a risk factor for autism. Now, the other risk factors include premature delivery before age 37 weeks, older parents, women over 35, men over 40, and then some common genetic variants, maybe these mitochondrial variants. That's it. So that's the risk factor bundle. When we were kids, back autism 1 in 10,000. Now CDC says as of 2022, it's 1 in 31. That means 3.2% of the population of kids with autism spectrum disorder, highly vaccinated California, where there's no ability to get exemptions, they're up to 5.2% of Californian kids have autism. And of the kids with autism, 27% have profound autism. Profound autism is defined as an IQ less than 55, nonverbal, can't communicate, wearing diapers, head banging, screaming for the rest of their lives. So we're here today talking about an existential crisis. 1% of California children and rising are extremely disabled from this. And in the CDC's report that came out on this, the conclusions, I mean, this was stunning when they were reporting, this tsunami of autism. Their conclusions are, oh, well, we should just plan for more special needs services.
Well,
Doesn't anybody want to know why? I mean,
no, of course they don't want to know why. But then it gets like
No.
then the gaslighting goes into like high gear. It's not just autism, it's neurodiversity. So neurodiversity becomes this giant psyop because Elon Musk is neurodiverse. My kid that has can really focus because he has ADHD and he can focus on certain things and he's a genius and
Whoa.
he's neurodiverse. And it's like no.
they want to accept it as the new normal.
Because then when everyone's neurodiverse, nobody is. And that's the whole point. That's the ultimate gaslighting. What you just said about 25% of that 1 in whatever it is, 35% of kids that are autistic, that are profoundly autistic. That is unbelievable. That isn't because of better diagnosis. That is because of an environmental source. Something did that to increase that incidence of these profoundly disabled children. And it is monstrous to not want to look into what causes that. like
Yeah,
whatever that may be.
right, to not show any alarm. So, what's critical to this seems to be this acute reaction to vaccines. So, recent randomized trial done in the hospital showed that, giving the vaccines in the hospital caused apnea. They showed that in the NICU. A paper by Miller shows the majority of sudden infant death syndromes occur within a few days of taking a big battery of vaccines because, if that apnea occurs at home and the parents don't observe it, the child can die. Now we have a paper by Nielsen and colleagues from Sweden showing that a febrile seizure of any cause, and the leading cause of a febrile seizure in a healthy child is getting a big battery of vaccines, there's a 40% chance that that child converts to a neuropsychiatric disorder. So attention deficit disorder, autism, tics, and epilepsy. So, this is a relatively straight line relationship. How many kids in the United States have a febrile seizure per year? 3 to 4%. So it makes sense. 40% of 3 to 4% looks like they're converting to autism. Now, vaccines can't be the cause of autism because the first case of autism we could find occurred long before the vaccines. But it must be a risk factor. Just like cholesterol is not the cause for coronary heart disease, it's a risk factor along with other risk factors. So we should start using the term risk factor, not cause, and start to untangle this because we do have an existential crisis. I have got 2 kids that will be coming into this family age soon. I'm very worried as a potential grandparent about a choice of taking the full vaccine panel. And a recent report from JAMA shows only 40% of expecting parents now are going to get the kids fully vaccinated.
Well, and I don't know. I think that's actually thinking, people actually doing their own research, which we were told not to do through COVID. So I think there's a challenge, though. I wrote a Substack last week called Unscrew. And the whole premise is, we don't go back to 1959. So if we just stopped vaccinating completely, we don't go back to 1959. We don't go back to the immune milieu that the population had, 65, 70 years ago. We go back, what we get is an unvaccinated population that's been vaccinated for 3 generations. And so there's some challenges with that. Like this is not just an easy, we've done too much vaccinating, stop vaccinating. Just like we're killing people's microbiome with antibiotics, don't ever prescribe antibiotics. I mean, that would be a total disaster. And I think of stuff, having delivered lots of babies, I think of stuff like, okay, getting chickenpox when you're a child as a childhood illness is really not that big of a deal. It's rarely anything more than an inconvenience. Getting chickenpox as a pregnant 25-year-old is a massive problem. Mm-hmm. And so, I can see, we need to tread carefully because, of course, from a press perspective, the first torch infection from an unvaccinated 25-year-old that, got chickenpox because she wasn't vaccinated or whatever. I mean, you can blow the whole thing up very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so to do no harm, I think we have to tread carefully. And the low-hanging fruit for me is stop that 1-day-old hepatitis B vaccine on mothers that don't have chronic hepatitis B. That's easy.
I would say get the vaccines out of this critical age of neurologic development. I mean, come on, they're giving adult pneumococcal and influenza vaccines to 6-month-old babies. I mean, that's just asking for trouble. Hepatitis B, all of these things can be given later in life. You get beyond age 9, most things are formed. The risks go way down when vaccines are given at an older age, way down. So, that's one way to go. So this idea of taking them later, separating them. So this, giving the big combination on the same day. If I prescribe 16 drugs to someone on the same day, or you guys did, I guarantee there's going to be a side effect. So we should probably space them out. If people really want to give vaccines, space them out one by one by one. And then lastly, I think the big thing is risk stratification. And we're going to have a mixed unvaxxed, vaxxed population. That's the reality because you know what? People aren't taking vaccines. The recent paper from Mawson and colleagues in the Florida Medicaid system, 10% of Medicaid kids, no vaccines. No vaccines. There's always been 2.5% of the U.S. population, the Amish, Mennonites, and others, no vaccines. So we've always had unvaccinated people around. but there's going to be way more unvaccinated people around. And the risk stratification principle says give the vaccines to people who would be at risk for serious complications.
Well, and the one that's common sense is yellow fever. So there's places you go to in the world where you would get a yellow fever vaccine because yellow fever is endemic there. Well, we were just in Key West, and we went to the Hemingway House, and the guy that owned the Hemingway House originally, his entire family was wiped out in a yellow fever epidemic in Key West. Well, do we give yellow fever vaccines in Florida anymore? Of course not, because we solved the problem. We got rid of mosquitoes. So, it's like vaccines didn't solve yellow fever, yet yellow fever was endemic in Florida. It isn't anymore.
Well, we actually comment on yellow fever here. The doctor who kind of invented the yellow fever vaccine, he won the Nobel Prize, but the yellow fever vaccine came out, I believe, 3 decades after the last yellow fever outbreak. After the last outbreak. You see what I mean? And you're right. If you go to countries, the countries don't enforce this, though.
No.
For instance, I looked this up recently, like what countries, do you need a yellow fever vaccine? And one of them was Kenya. I was just in and out of Kenya. They didn't ask for any vaccine. So I think it really is up to your own personal responsibility. If you're going to go to an area that's hot for yellow fever, that you should do that. But the point is risk stratification. So this is what I'd say. If I had a grandchild born with cystic fibrosis and tenuous lung function, I'd say, listen, get diphtheria and get pertussis, get influenza, because RSV, these infections could be fatal in a child with impaired lungs.
Right.
If I had a child who had a spleen removed because of Hodgkin's disease or congenital asplenia, or had a spleen taken out because of a bicycle or a car accident, I'd say, listen, get the pneumococcal, meningococcal, hemophiluenza vaccines. My brother-in-law had a spleen taken out for ITP, and I told him, get vaccinated. So the vaccines should be risk stratified, and we should take a careful look at this. It can't be what the World Health Organization wants. Have you heard of Agenda 2030?
Yes.
Yes.
Introducing 500 vaccines to underdeveloped, 500 different products? It can't be. There's got to be a limit. Just like you pointed out with the antibiotics or antihypertensives or anything, there's a limit where if you give too much, it's going to backfire.
Right. And my pet peeve working in South Florida now, in urgent care, is blood thinners. It's like, you meet the CHAD score risk and then you get on a blood thinner, and I'm like, yeah, but this guy's 97 years old, is in a walker and has fallen 5 times in the last year. And like I see it over. My joke is, if you go to Baskin Robbins in Venice, Florida, they ask you if you want Eliquis sprinkles on your ice cream.
Oh my gosh. I've never prescribed so many blood thinners in my life, but I agree with you on this idea of risk stratification. And one of you said that, well, wait a minute, if we stop vaccinating, it's not going to go back to 1950. So a good example of this in our book is we highlight what happened in Sweden when they didn't have a pertussis vaccine for 17 years. 17 years.
Wow.
There was no rebound in pertussis. Pertussis is very rare because we treat it with azithromycin. People have bad bronchitis. I don't test for it. I just treat them. And some of them probably have pertussis, and they're perfectly fine. So if we get to risk stratification, and then we have this blended immunity, I think we're going to be better off. Remember, for every vaccine, there's always a risk and benefit. So let's give the common ones. Chickenpox vaccine, for sure, made chickenpox become very uncommon. For sure. Okay. What's the downside to that? The downside is chickenpox vaccination is related to more shingles in adulthood. About 5 studies show that. So we have a lot more shingles today than we used to because people took the chickenpox vaccine. Now we have a shingles vaccine, which
And
we
just
give
go get the shingle shot for that.
right. We give 14 times the amount of viral load with the shingle shot compared to the shingle, and that's a big. And I've had that one too. So I've had them all, so I can speak for them. So
How are we going to change this? Because we know that big money talks, and if the vaccine companies, big pharma is behind, making money when every child is getting a gazillion shots, that's a lot of money to be made, and they're the big lobbyists in the government. How are we ever going to make any changes so that people have at least the choice to do risk stratification with their physician? Any thoughts?
The medical community has to come out. And so the best example was if we were on this podcast in 1949 and we were expressing our concerns regarding smoking and lung cancer, the Mayo Clinic would say, you guys are nuts. Smoking is safe. We recommend it to our patients in the Cleveland Clinic and Harvard, Hopkins. The entire medical community was enthralled with smoking. They were clearly about Philip Morris and American Tobacco. They all had major physician campaigns. I mean, it was going on. And so when Austin Bradford Hill and Dr. Dowley in the UK presented the physician data showing, listen, it causes lung cancer. Do you know the tobacco companies tried to kill these guys? They tried to suppress them, censor them, strip them, de-license them. It sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? So, we're looking at probably just like with the big tobacco settlement, we're going to look at some type of big settlement on vaccines and surely COVID vaccines. But, for that smoking example, we went all the way from 1950 to 1964. The medical community didn't do anything about smoking. Then Luther Terry, the Surgeon General, has to call the chiefs of medicine to Washington and say, listen, I got a Surgeon General report on smoking. It's not good, guys. You better stop smoking. And you better tell your patients. And you should see the look on the chiefs of medicine's face when they're going through the report. I mean, this is astonishing. This will be very similar when we call the chiefs of medicine to Washington to review the COVID-19 vaccine. It's going to be the same thing. And then still nothing happens. And the first campaign of physicians raising concerns to their patients about smoking is 1972 from the American Medical Association. So the point is, the medical community doesn't correct quickly on this. And you can see the concerns have been raised. Great credit given to Andrew Wakefield, who made one of the original observations. When he published it in Lancet in 1998, it stood as a valid paper until 2011. That should tell you something. And Wakefield just said, listen, we're observing some kids taking the MMR vaccine, having the same reaction that the polling case did, and the kids develop autism. He didn't say MMR causes autism. You notice some GI abnormalities as well as lymphoid hyperplasia. And that's it. So, and he was attacked by the medical community, the vaccine industry, and just, relentless over a decade. No one ever said his findings were invalid. They simply tried to destroy the man and said he had conflicts of interest. And that's ultimately how he was discredited. They did the same thing on smoking. They didn't try to invalidate the physician smoking study. They tried to smear the investigators.
Well, and that should tell you everything. When the American Academy of Pediatrics comes out last week with this Instagram post about how they want to get rid of every non-medical exemption for smoking. So no religious exemptions.
Or vaccines, you mean?
Or vaccines. No religious exemptions for vaccines. No, conscious. No, I've done my own research. No freedom. And you're like, you're over the target when you see stuff like that. There. And then I remember we were debating this on the group that you started, one of the COVID-19 or COVID-21 or whatever group.
Yeah.
And Harvey posts a picture from the American Academy of Pediatrics Foundation and who their sponsors were. And it was all the biggest vaccine companies, Sanofi, Merck, like the whole thing.
Oh my God.
And you're like, well, duh.
Well, isn't that interesting? So we have the American Academy of Pediatrics saying that your religion doesn't matter. Your ethical and religious directives don't matter. What matters is the vaccine religion. The vaccine religion takes precedence and is superior to your religion. That's what they're saying.
Yes.
That's what they're saying. This
Absolutely.
is a clash of religions. I'm going to speak on the 23rd of this month in Nashville, Tennessee on this. It's a clash of religions. It is a religious belief. Vaccines are accepted based on faith, not on science. It's a faith-based activity. That's the reason why people say, do you believe in vaccines? I don't have people coming up to me and saying, do you believe in ACE inhibitors? Do you believe
Very
in,
good point. Very good
right?
point.
No, nobody asks me if I believe in any other drug class, but they ask me if I believe in vaccines. Vaccines are accepted on faith. We've tapped into this in our book, and because it's so well cited and they make the characters come alive, I think people can read it quickly. It's big print, short chapters, and I think every doctor should read it because doctors honestly need to be grounded in this medical history. And we do readily recognize there's a reality. Vaccines have relieved us of the inconveniences of measles and chickenpox and taken away this terror of polio. There's no doubt about it. So there is a reality to it. It's a balanced book. John Leake and myself, we took the vaccines. We're not anti-vaxxers. And it has huge entertainment value. I've asked some of my French colleagues, I said, you got to read this. You have to tell me who's more arrogant, Louis Pasteur or Anthony Fauci.
Ooh,
Mm.
ouch.
Oh yeah, because Pasteur tried to create a chicken or a fowl cholera vaccine that failed miserably. He killed the chickens. Then he tried to create a sheep anthrax vaccine that failed miserably, and he killed the sheep. And then he created the rabies vaccine and just said it worked, and there was no way to know if the kids ever had rabies or not. And that the rabies vaccine, did ultimately develop into a full vaccine. But he's best known for something he did do right, which is pasteurization. That is, heating raw milk. Raw milk was so contaminated from these dirty cow udders and everything else. And that pasteurization at that time, remember, there was no refrigeration. So if you, milked a cow and you let that milk sit around, it got bad pretty quick and people drank it. And the infant mortality from drinking unpasteurized milk was through the roof because it sat around for a while. So nowadays people can drink raw milk, just like human breast milk is fine, provided it's gathered in the right way and it's refrigerated and all of that. But anyhow, Pasteur, he was a liar. He was a cheater. He stole other people's work. He wanted to experiment on prisoners from Brazil. He was brought to the highest levels of society. There was an entire institute, created for him, and his family. He kept his notes secret. He didn't patent anything because he wanted secrecy. And finally, his family releases his notes, I think in the 1960s or so. And you realize who this guy was.
Wow.
This is an unbelievable
That's
story.
fascinating.
Well, it explains what happened during the COVID vaccine campaign, because I didn't know this history. I didn't know they locked up people around 1780, 1790 in Boston if they didn't take the smallpox shot. They put them in jail.
Wow.
Now, I understand, listen, if that can happen in Boston then and happen in Toronto and London, I can tell you, you can see people losing their minds with COVID. It's the same thing.
Wow.
Exactly.
So tell everybody where they can get the book so that they can.
Anywhere you want to get book, Barnes
Yep.
and Nobles, Amazon, Skyhorse Publishing.
Yep.
I think it's required reading. And because it's so true to the history, it's going to help a lot. The timelines, the citations. I think many are going to use this in their own personal journey here. It's not a guide of what vaccine you should take or not, but it just gives you the historical underpinnings of where we are on this. I'd say, listen, as a medical doctor now, knowing what I know in today's environment, if I was a young parent, I would follow the half a dozen or studies that show that if a child today who's born, who's healthy, no complications, is healthier going without any vaccines, I think I would choose that approach. And then I'd take them much later on in life, become a doctor, get a hepatitis B vaccine, and go on a Christian missionary trip, maybe get some other vaccines, but much later in life.
Perfect. Thank you for being here, taking the time, Peter. We so appreciate it. And can't wait to
Yeah, I love
Okay.
you and John's writing is great. It is very engaging. I read tons of your Substacks, and I encourage people to do that. Focal Points. It really is. It's a great combination of an amazing scientist and an amazing true crime writer. So thanks again.
Okay. Bye, you guys.
Bye.
Bye.